The book of Numbers records the wilderness wanderings of Israel. Actually, it begins at Sinai and takes them to Kadesh Barnea, where the spies will rebel, and then it takes them in the wilderness for the next 38 years until finally that generation is gone, and God takes them again all the way around to the eastern side of the Jordan so that they can enter into the promised land. So what we see in the book of Numbers begins at Sinai, ends on the eastern side of the Jordan, with about 38 years of wandering in between, including the stop at Kadesh Barnea where they refused to go into the land. Throughout this time, what God is doing is He is preparing the nation. He is showing them their need to trust Him, and both as the events unfold and as He records them for the future nation, He is teaching them their need to really trust Him for what is to come. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, God quotes from Numbers and shows that what He's doing is showing them that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of God. He reviews the events of Numbers, showing them that what He's trying to teach them is their need to trust Him. Just by way of context, the picture that you're looking at is taken in Wadi Zin, which is the traditional place of much of Israel's wandering. Some have suggested even the bronze serpent was in this area, but you can see some of the desolation of where they are. The book of Numbers then can be understood in terms of the places and the journeys. So if we put it in the context of the Pentateuch, the book of Exodus takes them from Egypt to Sinai. So they start in Egypt, they go through the journey from chapter 13 to 19 to Sinai, and then the last part of the book of Exodus is the revelation of the law at Sinai. The book of Leviticus is written there as well. So Leviticus at least probably is during that time at Sinai. It doesn't have any other indication. The book of Numbers begins at Sinai, and so the first 10 chapters or so are at Sinai, but then we have a few chapters in which they're on the way to Kadesh Barnea. When they get there, the next 7 or 8 chapters are going to be in and around Kadesh Barnea as they wander in the wilderness and as God takes that generation out. And then it will be the trip to Moab, actually to the plains of Moab on the eastern side of the Jordan. And the final chapters of Numbers are there on the eastern side of the Jordan, which is where the book of Deuteronomy takes place. So I'd like to think of it in terms of the trips and the stops. And when we look at them, we have 3 of each. We have 3 trips and 3 stops in the book of Numbers, starting at Sinai. Sorry, 2 trips, but if we add in the trip from Exodus, we have 3 that we can compare. The reason I want to do that is because as we compare those trips, Gordon Wenham in his commentary on Exodus has shown that there are a number of events that are very similar. I'm sorry, his commentary on Numbers has shown that there are a number of very similar events in the same order. So if you follow them through, the events of the first trip from Egypt to Sinai in Exodus, the second trip from Sinai to Kadesh in Numbers, and the third trip from Kadesh to or around Kadesh to the plains of Moab in Numbers, all have similar sorts of events of God leading them, giving them victory, and yet they complain. Moses intercedes, God provides for them, and there are victories at the end. However, as you proceed through these 3 trips, if you notice the pattern, then there's a progression downward. The complaints get worse, the judgments get harsher, and God seems to be showing them that He expects them to do better each time around. When you learn the same lesson more than once, God expects you to have learned it the first time, or at least to have made progress. And that's not always the case. When we look at the stops in the book of Numbers, we have a similar sort of data. We have 3 stops, and in each of the 3 stops, again, in the book of Numbers, we have similar sorts of events. So God gives them promise, there's rebellion, again, intercession, God brings judgment, He reiterates some of the laws, and then there has to be atonement made for the people. And again, in each of these cases, as we move through these 3 stops from Sinai to Kadesh to Moab, we recognize that God's judgments gets harsher even as Israel's complaints and Israel's rebellion gets stronger. Just walking through it quickly, in the first 10 chapters, Moses prepares Israel to leave, and so we see a focus on worship, that Israel has to recognize their need to honor God first and foremost. This is both personal and corporate, and of course that includes the handling of the tabernacle, because it has to be done well if God is going to live within them. Israel must be holy, for He is holy. On the first trip in the book of Numbers, the second trip that we've seen since Exodus, the people again rebel. We see rebellion as a constant theme, and of course we're familiar with that. We're sometimes amazed, and we get down on the Israelites, and yet I think we also have to realize that we all are prone to wander and to rebel, to complain, to not like the way God is doing things in our lives. And so God has to bring judgment. God has to bring some challenges to show them that they really do have to trust him and that he has a better idea. Even Moses complains, but in this trip even, we see that God is fairly gracious, fairly generous. His fire burns at the edge of the camp, and yet in his anger, not many people die. In and around Kadesh for 38 years starts off with the rebellion of the spies. And of course, when Israel goes into land, God is showing them that he can do this. They have to trust him for it. He's already told them that there's no way they can do it on their own. But when the spies see the people, they are sure that they're not going to be able to do it, and they come back with a bad report. Only Caleb and Joshua give a good report. Only Caleb and Joshua show the crowd that yes, indeed, they can take the land that God has given to them. And so God chooses to let them die in the wilderness. And in fact, they say their little ones will die. Actually, their little ones will go in and they will die. But God is going to give judgment. The judgment continues as we see Korah, Dathan, and Abiram challenge the authority of Moses and the authority of Aaron. And God establishes his authority as he destroys those who would challenge him. And then God gives them a visual aid with the budding of Aaron's rod to show that God has chosen Aaron over all the others to be his special priest. Chapters 20 and 21, we see the trip then to the Promised Land, to actually the plains of Moab, and again, rebellion, and again, God is gracious, and God will take them through. In the final 15 chapters or so, we see God working on Israel's behalf even when they're not sure that they need it. So initially Balaam tries to curse Israel because Balak wants to hire him, and Balaam is more concerned about the money that he can get than he is about the God whom he serves. Of course, God will not allow him to verbally curse Israel, but Balaam chooses, as we see later, to curse them by telling Balak how he can get God against them, by enticing them into idolatry, and that's what we see at Baal Peor. Later on in the text, we realize it was Balaam's advice that gave that understanding to Balak, and it worked. Thousands of Israelites die because of their idolatry. God does the final preparations for going into the land. He defeats the enemies before them, but he reminds them most of all that he is the one who's in charge and that they must serve him. The book of Numbers then is going to give Israel a reminder that man does not live by bread alone. Man must trust God for all that they can have. Israel must trust God. We must trust God. We must therefore live in dependence on God. We can't do it our own way, nor can we assume that what we see is the way things are. God is the one who's in charge, and we must follow. Israel is prepared now to go into the land, at least as so far as they can be in the wilderness, and the book is reminding what those preparations must be. The picture in the background reminds me of Balaam, and I had a few more things I really wanted to share about Balaam, but this was a Bedouin fellow. I was sitting at Beersheba, and he was riding his donkey, and the donkey just stopped and laid down, and I thought of Balaam immediately. And he started kicking his donkey to get him back up. He finally jumped back on, and I realized, ooh, I needed a picture. And before the donkey got back up, at least I got one. But here we have 3 oracles that Balaam is going to deliver to the nation of Israel. Those oracles are going to give us a picture of how God sees the nation. And I wanted to at least take a quick snapshot of those before we left. In his first oracle, which is in chapter 23, after Balaam is talked into going by the lure of money, Balaam starts out by saying, in verse 7, from Aram Balak has brought me, the king of Moab, from the eastern mountains. Come curse Jacob for me and come denounce Israel. Verse 8, how can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? We see a similar thought in the second oracle. Again, in verses 18 through and 19, he says, rise Balak and hear, give ear to me, O son of Zippor. God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? Behold, I received a command to bless. He has blessed. I cannot revoke it. So God has blessed the nation of Israel. God has promised blessing to the nation of Israel, and no one can come and curse them. Of course, they can curse themselves, which is what Balaam realized and told Balak, so that he got them to take part in idolatry, and God would bring them cursing. But we see it probably culminating at the end in his third of his third oracle in chapter 24 and verse 9, talking about God bringing Israel out of Egypt. And he says, he crouched, he lay down like a lion, like a lioness, who will rouse him up. Blessed are those who bless you, and cursed are those who curse you. Sounds very familiar, because that is God's promise through the Abrahamic covenant, and that applies to the nation of Israel, because they are the seed of Abram, through whom God will bring blessing to the world. Now, initially they are to show God's character, but ultimately, of course, that will be Jesus. And as they turn away from him, he will discipline them, but others may not curse them. So the Balaam oracles are a reminder of what God is doing, and these three oracles of cursing actually are blessing, and so he has to try to entice them into sin in order to get God to bring any negative consequences for them. The book of Numbers then is really summarized in Deuteronomy 8, as I've mentioned already. In Deuteronomy 8, God is reminding Israel of what he did for them while they were in the wilderness. And if you will turn in your Bibles to Deuteronomy 8, I'd like you to just look at what God actually says about what he did, because what God is doing for the nation of Israel is important. God is disciplining them because of their failure to trust, absolutely, but he is not trying to hurt them. Look at first of all, let's start with verse 2. You shall remember the whole way the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you didn't know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Skipping on down actually to verse 16, just a reminder of what God has done, because for them it was painful, as we see in verse 15. It's this great and terrifying wilderness with fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground and no water, and they had to have water out of a rock. But look at verse 16. Who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end. And what we see with God's working with the nation of Israel in the book of Numbers is his purpose for them. He is not there to destroy them. He is there to discipline them, to test them, to teach them, so they can understand what is good. And what is good is to live not by their own mouths and by bread, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. It is obedience. It is following God. And that hasn't changed either. We still find God's good through obedience. We still find God's good through honoring his words.